What's cracking, everybody? I'm Joe Field, and today we're talking about my book review process, so stay tuned. I'd like to start off by saying that I have 10 different criteria that I like to look at. In those 10, each one is scaled from 0 to 10, giving me a grand total out of 100. But I do want to make something else perfectly clear first. The first thing is, especially in like American school systems, I think others as well, a lot of schoolwork is scaled similarly, except that we tend to view anything that is at about a 60% or lower as either a low pass or a failing grade. And that is not the case with this particular scoring system. Ultimately, the way that you should think about the scoring is that 0 is awful, 10 is amazing, and 5 is okay. 5 is passing, it's passable, but not by much. 5 just means that was kind of mediocre. And mediocre, of course, is a lot better than terrible, but it's still a pretty far cry from amazing. So when I give something a score of a 5, that looks on paper like I'm giving it an F. And that's not accurate. A 5 simply means that I thought it was okay, but I didn't think it was great. That's all it means. And I think that this is just really important to note, because if I give a book a 60, to a lot of people, a 60%, oh, that sounds awful. And that's not accurate. A 60% means that I actually enjoy it. I liked it more than I hated it. And that's worthwhile. We look at things as half empty. And so when we see, oh man, that he scored that as a 70, a lot of people would see that as a bad thing. But for me, a 70, I would be ecstatic. I would love it. I'd be like, this book was really, really good in a lot of different ways and just lacking in a few. So, for me, actually, I kind of like to have things in that critical area where I feel I can have some criticisms, but also generally like it. Let's get into the different categories. The first category that I have is character. Character, very basic category to have. Did I like the characters? Did I think they were believable? Did they have different quirks? Did I think they spoke in ways that were interesting or realistic? Did I believe that they were psychologically realistic? And for me, that's probably a big part of this category. I have a background in psychology, and as a result, I tend to look at the psychology of characters and try to appreciate how realistically they're drawn. If you have a character, for example, who seems to be switching personalities, and you're telling me that they have schizophrenia, that's going to be an issue for me, because no part of schizophrenia is having multiple personalities. Now, I know that some people nowadays, I think, are a little bit more in tune with different psychology terms, but in general, multiple personalities, which is now called dissociative identity disorder, is completely separate from schizophrenia. Schizophrenia is like hallucinations and delusions, for the most part. Okay, there's a lot of other things that go into it. Schizophrenia is very complicated. But my point is that there is no part of schizophrenia that is also dissociative identity disorder. And similarly, like, if you're telling me that a character is, any sort of way that they actually aren't. So a character, you say, oh, this character is super smart, and they're constantly doing stupid stuff, I'm not going to like that. If you tell me this character is really compassionate, but they're constantly upset with people and being really mean, I'm not going to like that either. If a character is really inconsistent, that's going to be an issue too. The second category is plot. Plot and character, I think, together make the two most important aspects, along with setting, which is going to be the third category, by the way. So Plot for me is whether or not it made sense ultimately. Did I see where things were going to be going in hindsight? Do I feel like questions that were asked at the beginning were answered by the end? Did I feel like things were moving in that direction? Were there a lot of really extraneous moments that had nothing to do with the overarching plot? These are important questions. And if they're not answered, or if the plot is somehow lacking in that regard, that's an issue. On the other hand, I think sometimes the plot is a lot like listening to a really nice piece of music. And you can kind of hear it and think, ooh, I think it's going to go in this direction. And then maybe it goes in a different direction that's really interesting. And then by the end, you can kind of feel like, wow, I really like that. I want to listen to it again. I think the plot can be a lot like that if it's done well. Otherwise, if it's not done well, if it's just a lot of different things happening all at once, I'm probably not going to be all that interested in it. The third category that I consider is setting. Setting speaks, I think, a lot for itself. How interesting is it? Now, not all settings are going to be the same, and not all settings need to be big, huge, lush, crazy worlds. In fact, some settings, it's better to keep it small and intimate. An entire setting could just be in a single room. I think, for me, one of the movies I like to think about is the movie Clue, which is based off of the board game Clue. I highly recommend it. It's a very funny film. But it all takes place within a mansion. And setting is really important because, similar to the board game, they're trying to figure out how a murder happened, who did it, and where it was done, and with what sort of implement. It's so much fun as a result. Like, the setting is very important to it. But they're not going out into crazy big places. They're all just within the same mansion. But the mansion itself is almost like a character. As all these other characters are rushing around trying to figure things out, the mansion itself is sort of like a secondary character who kind of goes unspoken for, that is just kind of there and messes with everybody. And it's great. Settings don't need to be big to be good. And sometimes big settings can be really bad. Small settings can also be terrible, but it just depends. So, for me, the things I'm going to look for in the setting are whether or not it's even mentioned. How well is it explained? Now, if I'm constantly getting explanations for setting, that's also probably going to ding a few marks off. If you were talking to me about every single pebble in the road, that's an issue. Because it's sort of ephemera that's not really important. Now, if you're telling me that the skies looked angry in some way, you're giving a lot more character to the world. And I actually prefer that kind of illustration. Not always. Sometimes it's fine to just say the skies were a looming dark gray, or an ominous black or something. But it depends on who the character is and what sort of perspective you're going for. And if I feel like the setting really does contribute to the plot, if you're doing a quest fantasy and every single place they go looks exactly the same, that's going to be a problem. If you're having the whole thing take place in a small city, the small city can totally have character of people doing different things, and you can use unnamed characters, for example, to create the environment. Those three together are kind of the most important aspects of a book, I think. And the other categories that I have after this are probably the ones you're going to have the most issues with. Just in terms of how subjective they are. Even though those three prior categories are subjective, because I'm a subjective person and I'm the one who's grading them. The fourth category is engagement. And what I'm specifically talking about with engagement is the emotions that I feel with the book. Do I laugh when the characters laugh? Do I cry when they cry? Do I hate the people I'm supposed to hate? Do I love the characters that I'm supposed to love? All of that can go into characterization, sure. But there's also the question of, if they're in the middle of a chase scene, Is my heart pounding like the characters' hearts are pounding? When the skies are gray and it's raining and they're trudging through mud and they're exhausted and tired, do I feel some of that exhaustion? Do I feel that same sort of tiredness that they do? And I think that for that reason, engagement is sort of should be in its own category. A book can still be good without having very high engagement. But in general, the best books will have really high engagement, for me at least. Les Miserables, which is one of my favorite novels of all time, had me very engaged. There were moments where I practically had my heart breaking for some of these different characters. And to me, that would probably get a 10 for engagement. Bad engagement would be, was I just bored with all the different characters? Was I practically rooting for the bad guy to get rid of all the main characters? That's an issue. Did I find everybody to be annoying? Was I rooting for absolutely no one? In fight scenes, did I feel no sense of tension? Was I constantly checking my watch or wanting to go on Facebook or something? You know, that would be low engagement. The next category is enjoyment, which is somewhat related but not as much. So enjoyment is just purely how much I liked the book. Some books I enjoy quite a lot, but I actually don't find all that interesting in some ways. So how much I enjoy a book could be related to anything from the prose to the characters to the setting to any number of different things or interplays between certain things. I just might really enjoy the book for itself. One book that I read that was sort of like that, I might catch some hate for this, but was one of the Harry Potter books. I think it was Order of the Phoenix. I remember reading it, and by the end I was like, wow, that was really enjoyable. But I don't know, I didn't really like it either, which is a strange place to be in. I really enjoyed it, but to me it felt very shallow and it didn't keep me in the same way that other books did. It didn't have me wanting the sequel necessarily, which is again a strange place to be for enjoyment, and it's hard to say what it was. I think the pacing for me was really good in that book. Again, this was years ago that I read it, so I can't go into too many specifics. But my point is that enjoyment in that case for me doesn't mean that I'm going to reread it necessarily, although that can be part of it. It may just be how innately readable I found it to be. And that aspect of enjoyment isn't directly tied into things like how I empathize with the characters, although it can be. It isn't directly tied into how awesome the setting is, although it can be. So I consider enjoyment to be its own sort of factor. Like some books I find to be much less enjoyable than others, but still really, really good, and I still like them on principle at least. Talking about something like Les Miserables, if you read it unabridged, there are tons of stretches where it's just him launching into long essays, and those are not enjoyable. They just are not. You'll have Victor Hugo talking about things like slang, French slang, on the streets in the 1800s. I have no interest in that. But he'll still talk about it, and he'll talk about it for many different chapters. So, to each their own, I suppose, but I would put some rather low enjoyment, especially in those moments. The next category is world building. World building, I think, has a lot more to do with the speculative fiction genre, into which fantasy, sci-fi, so on and so forth fall. What does poor world building look like? Inconsistencies in how the world functions? Explaining too much? Not explaining enough? It's usually really easy to see good examples of it. Bad examples sometimes as well, depending on how things are explained and when they're explained. Now, if you have a really, really intriguing world, or there's some very interesting aspect to it. So like, just a random example off the top of my head, if you, for example, have, well, I guess one example would be like in Terry Pratchett's Discworld, the world is supported by a giant flying turtle, then supports the elephants that hold the disc world. That's really interesting, and I kind of want to hear more about that. Like, it's really funny, and it's an interesting idea. That intrigues me. Now, if he spent tons of pages just talking about the sciences of it and was really bland with how he decided to go about talking about it, I might not like it. But as it was, I love that little bit of world building. And I love the sort of humor that he puts into it. Now, not everybody's going to use a humorous approach, but some people will. And that's totally fine. And the world building has to be interdependent with the story. If it is constantly being shoehorned into the story, that's usually a problem. But if you're able to find interesting ways of adding it to the story, so if all that you're doing is one character says, huh, I heard you just gave that guy a title. What was that title all about? And it launches into this big, long story about how that title came to be and how it actually meant something completely different back in the day. But now it's not that way, except that it still kind of is, and it's taken on a whole different meaning. It's just exhausting. There's got to be a better way to do it. And, there is. But if you don't do those better ways, you're going to get a low grade on world building. The next category is prose. Prose, I think, is really just much I like it, whether or not it matches up with what they're trying to do. Some of that can go into characterization a little bit. How do characters talk? When do they talk? If you have a really quiet character, why are they launching into monologues? That could be a good example of bad prose. How well do they grasp language? And how well do they use language? So, for me, that's another big part of it, is the prose. The next part is structure. So structure varies from prose in that the structure is predominantly the nuts and bolts of the novel. This means paragraph length. This means sentence variation. This means how you break up your chapters. If you use like inter-chapter breaks, that sort of thing. How you're using things like italics, bold, underline, if you're using any of those at all. Capitalization, that sort of thing. It's really kind of like the finer details of the book. If you're using really, really long paragraphs, you're probably going to get bad marks. If you're using very short paragraphs that could have been condensed into one slightly larger paragraph, that's also kind of an issue. If your dialogue tags are all over the place and I can't tell who's talking as a result, that's a problem. If your chapters are way too long, that's a problem. If they're constantly super short, that's also an issue. So it's really all about trying to hit that nice, happy medium. I am one of those people who will generally like shorter chapters. I am busy, and I think I probably have an undiagnosed case of ADHD. So having super long chapters means that I've got to sit still and in one place for a very long time. And that's not something that I can usually handle. And that's not something that a lot of other people can either. You have people who have, day jobs and maybe responsibilities at home, whether that's if you live by yourself, making your own dinner and trying to unwind from the day and take care of all the different household chores, or whether that's if you have children, taking care of them. As a result, having super long chapters can be a major barrier, especially if you're like me, and I like to feel like I've finished something in the amount of time that I've been reading. So if I am going to stop somewhere, I don't like stopping right at the top of a page in the middle of a chapter. I like to have finished the entire chapter and be able to say, there we go. I know I'm a certain amount of the way through the book, even further. Now, smaller chapters, say 2 to 3 pages, are great. in moderation. Sometimes it's nicer to have a few longer chapters. It's sort of like the Netflix method, right? So before Netflix and stuff, people didn't do the binge, right? Me, I have a really hard time sitting down and justifying watching a movie, but I have no problem watching 3 hours of a TV show. Themes. How are the themes handled in the book? And also, how are tropes and cliches handled? Preferably, there are no cliches, or very few of them, or if there are cliches, they are done in a comical fashion to make fun of them. If there are tropes, hopefully they're handled well. And, of course, every book is going to have tropes, because that's the way that it works. Tropes are unavoidable if you're going to do any kind of story that has rhyme or reason. And it's going to have themes, whether or not you really mean them to be in there or not. The question is how well you establish the themes, how well you explore them, the sort of conclusions that you come to, and so on. I think that an example of themes not really being handled very well comes about in the Sword of Truth series by Terry Goodkind. I actually happen to like his books. I find them enjoyable, at least. But the way that he handles the issue of free will is just painful in some cases. And it's something that keeps on happening in every single one of his books. And it's excruciating. Entire pages of a person ranting about how important it is to stand up and live your life. And as much as I agree with that general sentiment, I don't need to have pages of pontification about it. That's an example of themes done poorly. Subtlety here tends to be the key, I think. If you're really noticing super strong themes right off the bat, that may be an indication that it's not as good as it could be. With tropes, there are some tropes I like more than others, and I'll probably indicate that in whatever video that I'm reviewing. Tropes can be good or bad, and they can be handled well or poorly. The last category, and this is the one that I think people will have the hardest time accepting, is congruence. Now, the way that I'm using the word congruence here is to indicate the relationship between the promotional materials and cover of the book to its contents. Does the cover of the book match what's inside the book? Some people won't think this is fair, and we are generally trained not to think that it's fair. Like we always say, don't judge a book by its cover. But I'm going to go against that and say, actually, you should be able to judge a book by its cover, especially books. Why? Because the covers were developed specifically to advertise the contents of the book. Now, sometimes that isn't on the author. As a result, I do tend to grade this a little bit more flexibly and try to err on the side of being a little bit positive. So, what does good congruence look like in this case? Good congruence is, if you look at the cover, you can tell it's high fantasy immediately. And it is high fantasy. You can tell what kind of tone there will be just by looking at the cover. Like, that's also really helpful. I think one cover that has really good tone but doesn't tell you anything about the actual book is Twilight. You know? The apple in a dark background. Now, that doesn't tell me anything about the plot, okay? I don't even remember if there was an apple in the damn book, okay? But I do think that it matches the book fairly well, oddly. It is dark. There's red, which is sort of like blood, and they're vampires, so that works. But there is a sort of moodiness about it that really captures, I think, a lot of the essence of the book. Like, this is not a bright, sunshiny book. This is a little bit dark, a little bit more complex in some ways. It's not meant to be super fun and cheery, and it's not. I think that it matches the book quite well. So even though maybe I'm not the biggest fan of the cover, I think that it does a good job of being congruent with the book. And the same can be said for a lot of other books as well. Other times, so this is also subjectively how much I like the cover as well. So like for Twilight, I might give it like an 8 because it matches it really well, but at the same time, I don't think that it's necessarily perfect. You know, it's not great. I'm not a big fan of it personally, even if I think that it works well for it. So that's why I would give it an 8. On the other hand, I might really think that a cover looks amazing, but it has absolutely nothing to do with the contents of the book. One example of this might be Brandon Sanderson's The Way of Kings. I think that the artwork, which is done by Michael Whelan, looks really great. I think that there's a lot of really cool color. It's very fantasy looking. I don't remember anything like that in the book, though. And it didn't tell me anything about what the book was actually about. And for that reason, I probably scored a little bit lower, even though I really like the artwork. It just doesn't do anything in terms of... It doesn't tell me anything about the book. So that's another part of it, as well as reading the back cover. So if the back cover is telling me that it's a story about a young boy who has to leave his family to defeat the Dark Lord, but it's actually about like a teenage angst romance, that's also going to get a low grade. So that's just something to kind of keep in mind. With that said, all these categories, they're subjective. Even me choosing them, their inclusion is subjective. To me, this makes sense. It might not make sense to everybody else, and that's okay. If there's a category you think is complete BS, feel free to just add a 10 or make it a 5. You know, that's the easiest way to do it. A 5 would actually be average, so that's probably the better way to go. But hey, if you find a book that you really like, that you think, ooh, that cover is actually amazing, then just go ahead and bump it up to a 10. Doesn't make a difference. With that said, I hope you do decide to watch some of my reviews. If you have any questions, feel free to leave them in the comments below. If you like this video, leave a like. If you want to see more videos like this one, then feel free to hit the subscribe button. And I really hope to see you the next time. Stay magical.